The most dangerous mistake a person can make is believing they already know who deserves respect. The heavy oak doors of the Franklin Federal Courthouse swung open just after 8:30 on a gray Tuesday morning, and the quiet rhythm of another routine hearing settled over the marble hallways as attorneys adjusted their briefcases, reporters checked their notes, deputies exchanged casual greetings, and visitors shuffled through the security line without imagining that before the hour was over, every assumption inside that building would be turned upside down. Officer Daniel Brooks stood near courtroom 7 with the confidence of a man who had spent nearly 2 decades believing his instincts were never wrong. His polished uniform, neatly pressed sleeves, and calm posture projected absolute certainty, and people often mistook that certainty for wisdom. To many around him, Daniel represented order. He believed he could recognize trouble before it spoke a single word. As another group approached the courtroom entrance, his attention settled on one woman walking alone with measured, unhurried steps. She wore a simple navy blazer over a cream blouse, carried a slim leather portfolio, and never once looked distracted by the crowd surrounding her. Naomi Carter moved with remarkable composure, her expression steady, her shoulders relaxed, her eyes quietly scanning the hallway without searching for approval from anyone. She looked like someone who understood exactly where she belonged. Daniel frowned almost immediately. Something about her calm confidence irritated him. Instead of seeing professionalism, he convinced himself he was looking at arrogance. Instead of asking a question, he reached a conclusion. He stepped directly into her path. "Ma'am, stop right there." Conversations nearby softened. Several people slowed their pace. Naomi stopped without hesitation and met his eyes with a calm expression that revealed neither fear nor frustration. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked politely. Daniel ignored the question. "I need to see your identification." Without arguing, Naomi reached slowly toward her portfolio. Before she could remove anything, Daniel lifted a hand. "Leave it where it is." A few spectators exchanged curious glances. Someone whispered that she must have tried to enter a restricted courtroom. Another quietly assumed she was being questioned over an ongoing case. Rumors formed faster than facts. Naomi remained completely still. "Officer," she said evenly, "there appears to be a misunderstanding." Daniel answered with a firm shake of his head. "You can explain everything after we step inside." The silence that followed seemed strangely louder than the chatter from moments before. Naomi looked around the hallway only once. Her eyes briefly rested on the courtroom doors, then on the American flag standing beside the entrance, before returning to Daniel with the same remarkable calm. She never protested. She never raised her voice. She simply extended her hands exactly as instructed, leaving everyone nearby convinced they were watching another ordinary courthouse arrest. Several reporters instinctively reached for their cameras. Court staff paused their conversations. Even the deputy clerk looked away, assuming the matter had already been settled. But hidden among the spectators were several individuals in plain business attire who exchanged nearly invisible glances without saying a single word. One man discreetly touched the earpiece beneath his collar. A woman near the back quietly closed a folder and checked the time. None of them intervened. None of them looked surprised. They simply watched as Officer Daniel Brooks escorted Naomi Carter toward courtroom 7, completely unaware that the quiet woman walking beside him carried far more authority than anyone inside that courthouse could possibly imagine. The quiet procession toward courtroom 7 came to a complete stop as Officer Daniel Brooks guided Naomi Carter through the polished wooden doors, and for a brief moment the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Every bench was nearly filled. Attorneys organized thick case files. Court reporters adjusted their equipment. Jurors exchanged uncertain glances while spectators leaned forward, eager to understand why a composed woman in professional attire was being escorted into the courtroom under such unusual circumstances. Naomi neither resisted nor complained. She simply walked with calm, deliberate steps, her expression unchanged despite the growing attention surrounding her. Judge Eleanor Whitmore looked up from the documents spread neatly across her bench, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly as she observed the unexpected interruption. "Officer Brooks," she said evenly, "this courtroom was scheduled to begin in less than 5 minutes. Explain the delay." Daniel stood straighter, convinced he was protecting the integrity of the proceedings. "Your Honor," this individual attempted to enter without properly identifying herself. Until her status is confirmed, I believe temporary detention is appropriate. A low murmur drifted across the gallery. Some visitors nodded in quiet approval, while others whispered that courthouse security had become stricter in recent years. Assumptions spread effortlessly through the room because certainty often arrived long before truth. Naomi remained silent. She did not interrupt Daniel. She did not challenge his statements. She simply watched each person who spoke with remarkable patience, almost as though she were listening to a conversation she had expected long before this morning. A young deputy clerk glanced at Naomi's leather portfolio resting on the evidence table nearby. It appeared ordinary, containing nothing more than neatly organized folders and a small notebook. Yet something about the way Naomi occasionally looked toward it suggested that whatever mattered most had never left her control. Daniel noticed her glance and interpreted it as nervousness. "You will have every opportunity to explain yourself," he said firmly. "For now, you will remain where you are." Naomi slowly turned her attention back toward him. "Officer Brooks," she replied in a calm voice that carried clearly through the courtroom. "Sometimes the difference between confidence and certainty is the willingness to verify the facts." Daniel answered with a restrained smile. "That is exactly what we are doing." Several people quietly chuckled, believing the exchange had settled the matter. Yet the reaction was not shared by everyone. Near the rear entrance, 3 individuals dressed in conservative business suits exchanged brief eye contact before returning their attention to the front of the room. One discreetly checked the time on a silver watch. Another folded a legal pad without writing another word. Their composure stood in sharp contrast to the growing curiosity filling the courtroom. Judge Whitmore studied Naomi for another moment. Years on the federal bench had taught her that confidence could take many forms, and the woman standing before her displayed none of the panic usually associated with an unexpected detention. Instead, there was quiet discipline, measured breathing, and an unmistakable sense of purpose. Even the court reporter found herself hesitating before striking the next key. Outside, rain began tapping gently against the courthouse windows, soft enough to fade beneath the steady hum of fluorescent lights. Inside, every eye remained fixed on Naomi Carter, unaware that the room was no longer waiting to discover who she was. It was waiting to discover how completely they had misunderstood the moment from the very beginning. Daniel Brooks had spent most of his career believing that hesitation created weakness. Decisions in his mind were supposed to be immediate, firm, and unquestioned. That belief had earned him praise from some supervisors and admiration from younger officers who viewed confidence as the highest form of leadership. Standing inside courtroom 7, he saw nothing unusual about the woman before him except the calmness that continued to challenge his assumptions. Naomi Carter stood with her hands relaxed at her sides, neither impatient nor intimidated by the dozens of curious eyes fixed upon her. The courtroom had become unusually quiet. Even casual conversations between attorneys faded into whispers, as people waited for someone to explain what had brought this composed stranger into the center of the morning's proceedings. Naomi could feel every glance in the room, yet none of them seemed capable of disturbing her focus. She had walked into conference rooms filled with cabinet officials, testified before congressional committees, and faced decisions carrying national consequences. Compared with those moments, the silence inside this courtroom felt almost familiar. She understood something that few others did. The loudest room was often the one where people knew the least. Judge Eleanor Whitmore continued observing both Daniel and Naomi with measured patience. Experience had taught her that confidence could sometimes conceal mistakes just as easily as it could reflect competence. She noticed that Naomi never searched the room for sympathy. She never attempted to persuade the spectators. Instead, she remained quietly attentive, as though every passing second confirmed something she had already expected. Several rows behind the attorneys, a middle-aged reporter opened his notebook and began writing descriptions of the unusual interruption. He guessed that the unidentified woman might become another minor courthouse story that would disappear before the evening news. Beside him, another journalist quietly adjusted a camera lens but hesitated before taking a photograph. Something about Naomi's expression suggested this story had not yet reached its beginning. Daniel finally broke the silence. "For the record," he said, addressing the judge, "I acted according to courthouse security procedures." His voice carried the confidence of someone convinced the facts would eventually justify every decision. Naomi turned toward him with the same composed expression she had maintained since entering the building. "Procedures matter," she answered gently. "They protect everyone when they are applied with patience as well as authority." Her words were respectful, yet they lingered throughout the courtroom far longer than anyone expected. A few spectators exchanged uncertain glances. They had anticipated anger, excuses, or emotional protests. Instead, they found themselves listening to someone who spoke with remarkable restraint. It was difficult to reconcile that quiet dignity with the assumptions many had already accepted only minutes earlier. Near the rear entrance, the three individuals in business suits remained perfectly still. One briefly received a message on a secure phone before slipping it back into a jacket pocket without changing expression. Another looked toward the courtroom clock, which showed less than 3 minutes before the scheduled hearing. The timing appeared increasingly important, although no one outside their small circle understood why. Rain continued falling against the courthouse windows, soft enough to blend into the distant sounds of traffic beyond the marble walls. Inside, uncertainty slowly replaced confidence. People no longer wondered only who Naomi Carter was. They began wondering why someone carrying herself with such quiet assurance seemed completely unconcerned about what everyone else believed was about to happen. Judge Eleanor Whitmore rested her reading glasses on the bench and allowed the silence to linger a few moments longer, hoping someone would offer a simple explanation that would return the courtroom to its ordinary routine. None came. The atmosphere continued changing in subtle ways that were difficult to describe but impossible to ignore. The attorneys who had been reviewing motions now watched Naomi Carter instead of their own files. Jurors shifted in their seats, sensing that whatever had delayed the hearing was becoming more significant than the case they had been summoned to hear. Officer Daniel Brooks interpreted the silence differently. To him, every passing second reinforced his confidence that caution had prevented a serious security mistake. He folded his hands in front of him and addressed the courtroom with measured certainty. "Your Honor, courthouse safety depends on verifying every individual whose identity cannot immediately be confirmed. No exceptions." His words sounded reasonable, and several spectators quietly nodded. They had no reason to question an experienced officer wearing a badge. Naomi listened without interrupting. Her expression remained composed, almost thoughtful, as though she were studying not Daniel himself but the assumptions surrounding him. She had encountered similar moments throughout her career, moments when certainty traveled faster than curiosity. She knew that once people believed they understood someone, evidence often struggled to catch up with opinion. A young law student seated near the back leaned toward an older attorney and whispered, "She still has not argued once." The attorney answered softly, "That is the part one cannot explain." Daniel heard neither comment. He stepped toward the evidence table and carefully placed Naomi's leather portfolio beside a stack of court documents. "This will remain here until identification is completed," he stated. Naomi looked at the portfolio for only a brief moment before returning her attention to the judge. There was no sign of urgency in her face. If anything, she appeared unusually patient, almost as though time itself had become her strongest ally. Judge Whitmore noticed the exchange. "Miss Carter," she asked calmly, "is there anything you wish to say before this court proceeds further?" Every eye in the room shifted toward Naomi. Reporters lifted their pens. Court staff paused in place. Even the rain outside seemed quieter against the tall courthouse windows. Naomi answered in the same steady voice she had maintained since entering the building. "Only this, Your Honor. Every decision deserves the opportunity to stand beside the complete truth." The sentence was neither emotional nor dramatic, yet it settled over the courtroom with unexpected weight. Daniel responded almost immediately. "The truth begins with proper identification." Naomi met his eyes without the slightest trace of resentment. "Sometimes it begins with allowing someone the chance to provide it." An uneasy silence followed. Several spectators who had quietly supported Daniel moments earlier now exchanged uncertain glances. The confidence that had filled the room when Naomi first entered had slowly begun giving way to curiosity. Near the rear doors, one of the quiet observers in a dark business suit glanced toward the courtroom clock once more. Less than 60 seconds remained before the scheduled hearing was supposed to begin. He gave an almost invisible nod to the woman standing beside him, who gently adjusted the folder in her hands without taking a single step forward. Whatever they were waiting for had nearly arrived. Yet no one else inside courtroom 7 understood that the next ordinary request would quietly transform every assumption made. That morning into the beginning of an entirely different story. The second hand on the courtroom clock reached the top of the hour with quiet precision, yet no one made a move to begin the scheduled hearing. Instead, an almost invisible tension settled across the room, the kind that could not be explained by delayed paperwork or an unexpected security concern. Judge Eleanor Whitmore glanced once more toward Officer Daniel Brooks before directing her attention back to Naomi Carter. Years on the federal bench had taught her to notice what other people overlooked, and one detail continued to stand out above everything else. Naomi never looked worried about what might happen next. She looked patient, as though every passing second was bringing the room closer to the answer she already knew. Daniel interpreted that calm very differently. To him, confidence without verification only reinforced suspicion. "Your Honor," he said respectfully, "before these proceedings continue, I recommend that all credentials associated with this individual be independently confirmed." Judge Whitmore nodded slowly. "That seems reasonable." Naomi offered a slight smile that revealed neither approval nor disagreement. "Verification is always appropriate," she replied, "as long as every available fact is examined." Her answer sounded so measured that even the court reporter paused before striking another key. There was no trace of irritation in her voice. She was not defending herself. She was inviting the process to continue. The distinction escaped almost everyone in the room. Across the gallery, the reporters who had expected a routine courthouse interruption now sensed that something far more significant was unfolding. One quietly lowered his notebook, choosing instead to simply observe. Another noticed that several courthouse employees who rarely left administrative offices had gathered near the rear entrance without speaking. They were not watching Naomi with curiosity. They were watching the clock. Near the evidence table, Naomi's leather portfolio remained exactly where Daniel had placed it. Its polished surface reflected the overhead lights, appearing no more remarkable than any ordinary case folder carried into federal court every day. Yet Daniel found himself glancing toward it more often than he intended. Something about Naomi's complete lack of concern unsettled him in ways he could not explain. Most people became impatient when separated from their identification or personal belongings. She had not asked for either. She simply waited. Imagine standing in a room where everyone believes they already know your story, yet you alone understand that the final chapter has not even begun. That was the quiet difference between appearance and reality inside courtroom 7. Judge Whitmore leaned slightly forward. "Miss Carter," she said evenly, "before I instruct the clerk to proceed with formal verification, I will ask you one final question. Is there anything this court should know at this moment?" Naomi met the judge's eyes with calm respect. "Only that every institution earns trust by allowing truth to arrive before judgment." The sentence lingered in the silence that followed. Daniel folded his arms, convinced those words were simply another attempt to delay the inevitable. Yet from the rear of the courtroom came the soft sound of a door opening. No one rushed inside. No one raised a voice. 3 individuals dressed in dark business suits entered with quiet professionalism and took measured steps toward the center aisle. Their expressions remained composed, their movements deliberate, and although they displayed no visible urgency, something about their presence caused several experienced attorneys to stop writing and look up at the very same moment. Without realizing it, nearly everyone inside the courtroom shifted their attention away from Naomi Carter and toward the newcomers, unaware that the next request would force every assumption made that morning to face its first real test. The 3 newcomers advanced only a few steps before stopping near the center aisle, their presence commanding attention without a single raised voice. They wore dark business suits with the quiet confidence of people who had spent years inside federal buildings where authority was measured not by volume but by responsibility. The tallest among them looked first toward Judge Eleanor Whitmore before respectfully speaking. "Your Honor, we apologize for the interruption. We request permission to clarify an important matter before these proceedings continue." The courtroom became perfectly still. Judge Whitmore studied the group for a brief moment. Their credentials were displayed discreetly, Yet there was something unmistakably official about the way they carried themselves. "You may proceed," she replied. Officer Daniel Brooks remained composed, although uncertainty had begun replacing the certainty he had carried only minutes earlier. He glanced toward Naomi Carter, expecting some sign of relief or satisfaction. Instead, she remained exactly as she had from the beginning, calm, attentive, and remarkably patient. It was almost as though this moment had arrived precisely on schedule. One of the officials turned toward Daniel with professional courtesy. "Officer Brooks, before any further action is taken, we ask that Miss Carter be allowed access to her personal identification." Daniel hesitated for the first time that morning. "Identification has not yet been verified," he answered carefully. "That is why we are requesting it," the official replied with the same calm tone. "No acquiescen. No confrontación." Simply a request supported by quiet confidence. Judge Whitmore nodded toward the evidence table. "Officer Brooks, please return the portfolio." Daniel walked to the polished wooden table and picked up the slim leather case. As he handed it back, Naomi accepted it with a polite smile. "Thank you, officer." There was no trace of sarcasm in her voice. She opened the portfolio slowly and removed a small black leather credential holder. Every movement was deliberate, unhurried, almost ceremonial. The room seemed to stop breathing. Reporters lowered their pens. Jurors leaned forward. Even the rain outside faded beneath the silence inside the courtroom. Naomi opened the credential holder and presented it first to the judge before turning it toward the nearest federal official. The gold seal reflected the courtroom lights for only a second before the lettering beneath became unmistakably clear. Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Judge Whitmore's expression changed instantly from curiosity to astonishment. The official standing beside her gave a respectful nod. "Confirmed, Your Honor." A quiet wave of disbelief moved across the gallery. Several attorneys exchanged stunned glances. The young law student who had whispered earlier slowly lowered his notebook, unable to find words. Daniel stared at the credential, reading the title once, then again, as though expecting different letters to appear the second time. Everything he believed he understood about the morning dissolved in complete silence. Naomi gently closed the credential holder and looked toward him with the same composed expression she had carried from the moment they first met outside the courtroom. "Officer Brooks," she said softly, "verification is always strongest when it begins before conclusions." No one laughed. No one whispered. The assumptions that had filled courtroom 7 only moments earlier disappeared beneath the undeniable weight of truth. And as the realization settled over every person present, another question quietly emerged inside the room. If the woman they had mistaken for an ordinary visitor was the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, then what had truly brought her to this courthouse on this particular morning? For several long seconds, no one inside courtroom 7 spoke. The title displayed on Naomi Carter's credential had changed more than her identity. It had transformed the atmosphere itself. Confidence gave way to uncertainty. Assumptions gave way to uncomfortable reflection. Officer Daniel Brooks remained motionless, replaying every decision he had made since stopping her outside the courtroom. He had followed what he believed were proper procedures, yet he could no longer ignore a question quietly forming in his own mind. Had he investigated the situation, or had he investigated the impression he formed before asking enough questions? Judge Eleanor Whitmore carefully returned the credential to Naomi with visible respect. "Director Carter," she said calmly, "the court appreciates your patience." Naomi accepted the credential with a gracious nod. "Thank you, Your Honor." Patience is often the only way truth has time to arrive. The 3 federal officials standing nearby stepped forward together. The senior official placed a sealed folder on the clerk's desk. "With the court's permission, we are prepared to explain why Director Carter is present this morning." Every reporter immediately reached for a notebook. Every attorney turned toward the bench. Even the jurors, whose role had seemed so important only minutes earlier, realized they were witnessing something entirely different from the hearing they expected. Judge Whitmore nodded. "Proceed." The official opened the folder with deliberate care. For the past 11 months, multiple federal agencies have conducted a confidential review concerning allegations of procedural misconduct, evidence handling failures, and unauthorized information sharing connected to several criminal investigations processed through this district. A quiet murmur spread across the courtroom. The official continued. Today's hearing was scheduled not only to address an individual criminal matter, but also to begin the legal process surrounding those findings. Director Carter personally supervised the final stage of that review. Daniel felt the words settle heavily across the room. This was never an ordinary courthouse visit. Naomi had not arrived as an observer. She had arrived carrying responsibility for one of the most significant federal oversight operations the courthouse had seen in years. Imagine believing you are protecting a courtroom, only to discover that the person you stopped was leading the effort to protect the integrity of the entire system. That realization spread silently across every face in the gallery. Naomi finally spoke again, her voice remaining calm and measured. This investigation was never about embarrassing individuals. It was about protecting public confidence. Every honest officer, every ethical attorney, every fair judge depends upon a justice system that earns trust through accountability. Her words contained no anger, no desire for humiliation, and no celebration of being proven right. Instead, they carried the steady conviction of someone who understood that real authority existed to strengthen institutions rather than diminish them. Judge Whitmore looked toward Daniel, whose expression had shifted from certainty to thoughtful reflection. Before anyone else could speak, Naomi addressed him directly. Officer Brooks, every person who serves the public will eventually face a moment that tests judgment more than procedure. What defines that moment is not whether we make assumptions. It is whether we are willing to recognize them when the truth appears. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly before meeting hers again. For the first time that morning, he offered a quiet nod instead of an immediate answer. Around them, the courtroom remained silent, not because anyone had been instructed to remain quiet, but because every person present understood they were no longer watching a simple misunderstanding unfold. They were witnessing the beginning of a much larger conversation about responsibility, humility, and the kind of justice that asks every person, regardless of title or badge, to be accountable to the same truth. No one hurried to leave their seat. The scheduled hearing had quietly become something far more meaningful than anyone expected when they entered the courthouse that morning. Judge Eleanor Whitmore instructed the clerk to temporarily suspend the original docket, while the federal review was formally entered into the record. There was no confusion in her voice, only the steady professionalism expected from someone determined to let facts guide every decision. Across the courtroom, attorneys who had arrived prepared to argue a routine case now found themselves carefully rereading documents that suddenly carried greater importance. Reporters spoke only in hushed tones, aware that every sentence they published would shape how the public understood what had happened inside these walls. Officer Daniel Brooks remained standing where he had been for most of the morning, yet everything about his posture had changed. The certainty that once defined him had given way to thoughtful reflection. He watched Naomi Carter speaking quietly with the federal officials, noticing how every conversation around her remained respectful, measured, and focused entirely on the responsibilities ahead rather than the misunderstanding behind them. She had every opportunity to embarrass him publicly, yet she never once attempted to do so. That realization unsettled him more than any criticism could have. Imagine expecting humiliation after making a serious mistake, only to discover that the person you misjudged is more interested in protecting the integrity of the institution than proving a personal point. That was the lesson slowly unfolding before everyone present. Naomi accepted another folder from the senior federal official before walking toward Judge Whitmore. "Your Honor," she said, "our objective remains exactly what it has always been: to strengthen confidence in the justice system through transparency, accountability, and fairness for every person who enters this courthouse." Judge Whitmore nodded with genuine appreciation. "Director Carter, this court shares that objective." The words carried through the silent courtroom with quiet authority. Daniel finally stepped forward. His voice was lower than before, absent of the confidence that had once sounded unshakable. "Director Carter," he said sincerely, "I recognize that my conclusions came before I understood the complete situation. For that, I accept responsibility." Naomi looked at him for a moment before offering a respectful nod. Accountability begins when we choose to learn instead of defend our assumptions. There was no anger between them, only an honest recognition that public trust depended upon people being willing to grow from difficult moments. Several younger deputies standing near the courtroom entrance exchanged thoughtful glances. They had witnessed procedures their entire careers, but today they had witnessed something far more valuable. They had seen humility become part of leadership. The senior federal official then addressed the courtroom one final time. The review identified areas requiring additional oversight, updated training, and stronger verification procedures. Many dedicated public servants contributed to these improvements, and that work will continue. His statement shifted the focus away from any single individual and back toward the institution itself. The room seemed lighter than it had only minutes earlier. Not because every problem had disappeared, but because truth had replaced speculation. Rain continued falling beyond the courthouse windows, washing across the stone steps outside while sunlight slowly began breaking through the clouds. Inside courtroom 7, the atmosphere had changed just as dramatically. The story was no longer about a mistaken detention. It had become a reminder that justice earns respect not by pretending mistakes never happen, but by ensuring that honesty, accountability, and fairness always have the final word. The hearing resumed later that afternoon, but those who had witnessed the remarkable morning inside courtroom 7 understood they would remember something far more important than any ruling entered into the official record. They would remember the quiet moment when assumptions met evidence, when certainty yielded to truth, and when dignity proved stronger than prejudice. Director Naomi Carter gathered the final folders from counsel table and thanked Judge Eleanor Whitmore, the federal review team, and the court staff for their professionalism throughout the unexpected events. Her voice never carried triumph because she had never come seeking victory over another person. She had come to protect confidence in a system that belonged to every citizen equally. As the courtroom slowly emptied, several young law students remained seated, speaking softly among themselves about what they had witnessed. One admitted that he had accepted the first explanation without asking a single question. Another confessed that he had mistaken calmness for weakness. Their professor listened quietly before offering a simple observation. The law demands evidence. Good judgment demands humility. Those words stayed with everyone who heard them. Near the courtroom entrance, Officer Daniel Brooks waited respectfully until Naomi approached. He no longer stood with the certainty that had defined him at the beginning of the day. Instead, he carried the quieter confidence of someone willing to learn from an uncomfortable truth. Director Carter, he said sincerely, today reminded me that experience is valuable only when it remains open to correction. I will remember that. Naomi offered a warm smile. The public does not expect perfection from those who serve. They expect honesty, fairness, and the courage to improve. Daniel nodded. He understood those words would shape every decision he made long after the courthouse lights dimmed that evening. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. Sunlight reflected across the courthouse steps, and people leaving the building paused for a moment beneath the clear afternoon sky before continuing toward their cars, offices, and